I would rather say that I have director approval, and that is true.
The camera pans across a smoky, dimly lit Hollywood nightclub of the early 1950 seconds. A murmur ripples through the crowd as a woman, radiant beyond comprehension, enters the room. She is Marilyn Monroe, America's ultimate blonde bombshell, the embodiment of both fantasy and fragility. Every head turns, every whisper sharpens, and yet behind her megawatt smile hides a woman searching desperately for love, stability, and belonging. Across town, in a different arena, another kind of American idol reigns. Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, is baseball's golden boy, stoic, disciplined, and revered by millions. His name is synonymous with victory, his 56-game hitting streak immortalized as the stuff of legend. To the public, Joe is the symbol of strength, masculinity, and order in a rapidly changing post-war America. When Marilyn and Joe's worlds collide, it feels like destiny. Hollywood's brightest starlet and baseball's most beloved hero, two icons wrapped in glamour and perfection. To the tabloids, it's the romance of the century. To fans, it's the fairy tale everyone thought they needed. But beneath the glittering headlines and magazine covers, a darker truth was brewing. Joe's quiet, traditional values clashed with Marilyn's unstoppable rise to superstardom. He wanted a devoted housewife. She craved independence and artistic recognition. He was jealous, intensely private, and sometimes controlling. She was flirtatious, free-spirited, and addicted to the limelight. Their union, from the very beginning, was not a fairy tale, it was a ticking time bomb. And then came the moment that shattered everything, a single gust of wind on a New York street corner in 1954. Marilyn's white dress, billowing above a subway grate, captured in flashing cameras, cemented itself as one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. The world saw beauty, allure, and Hollywood magic. Joe saw betrayal, humiliation, and a wife he could no longer control. That night, what happened behind closed doors would forever haunt their marriage and expose the cracks in America's picture-perfect dream couple. This is not just the story of a love affair. It is the story of obsession, jealousy, and the suffocating pressure of fame. A story that ends not with a happy home, but with heartbreak, scandal, and tragedy. Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio, two legends, locked in a toxic dance between passion and destruction, youth and background. Before they ever crossed paths in Hollywood, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio lived worlds apart, yet both were forged by hardship, abandonment, and a longing for stability that would later define their turbulent relationship. Marilyn's fragile childhood. Born Norma Jean Mortensen in 1926, Marilyn's childhood was anything but glamorous. Her father vanished before she was born, leaving her mother, Gladys, struggling with severe mental health issues. Norma Jean was placed in foster homes, shuffled between guardians, and even spent time in an orphanage. The one constant in her young life was instability. She grew up with the aching knowledge that she was unwanted, and that deep hole in her heart would follow her forever. As a teenager, she found escape in movies, idolizing glamorous stars and dreaming of becoming one herself. But behind that dream lurked fear, the fear of being abandoned again, the fear of being unseen. At just 16, desperate to avoid returning to the orphanage system, she married her neighbor, James Doherty. But Norma Jean was never meant for domesticity. The marriage dissolved when he was deployed and she was discovered by a photographer. From then on, she transformed herself into Marilyn Monroe, peroxide blonde, sultry smile, and a voice that quivered with both vulnerability and seduction. By the early 1950 seconds, Marilyn was no longer Norma Jean. She was Hollywood's rising star. Men wanted her, women envied her, and she was about to become one of the most famous faces in the world. But the wounds of her childhood, the craving for unconditional love and security, remained wide open. Joe's rigid roots. Joe DiMaggio's beginnings couldn't have been more different. Born in 1914 to Italian immigrant parents in Martinez, California, Joe was the eighth of 9 children. His father, a stern fisherman, expected Joe to join the family business. But Joe hated the sea, the smell of fish, the grueling labor, the endless routine. Instead, Joe found salvation in baseball. On the field, he discovered order, control, and a way to escape his father's disappointment. He wasn't flamboyant like Babe Ruth, nor loud like other athletes. Joe was methodical, disciplined, and deeply private. His consistency, his 56-game hitting streak, became a national obsession, a testament to his stoicism and grit. But off the field, Joe was conservative to the core. He believed in family values, a wife who stayed at home, and a quiet life away from the spotlight. Fame embarrassed him. He never sought attention outside of baseball. Unlike Marilyn, who thrived under the flashing lights, Joe recoiled from them. Two destinies on a collision course. By the time Marilyn was conquering Hollywood, Joe had already retired from baseball, his career immortalized. Yet retirement left him restless. He wasn't ready to fade into obscurity, nor was he prepared for the loneliness that came when the crowd stopped cheering. When Joe first saw Marilyn on screen, he was captivated not by her fame, but by the innocence he thought he saw behind her sensual image. To him, Marilyn wasn't just the world's sex symbol. She was a wounded bird he longed to protect. For Marilyn, Joe represented everything she never had: stability, devotion, and the promise of someone who wouldn't abandon her. He was calm where she was chaotic, grounded where she was volatile. But in truth, they were bound by illusions. Joe wanted Norma Jean, the sweet girl he thought existed beneath the Hollywood persona. Marilyn wanted the security of Joe's love, without giving up the dazzling career she had fought so hard to build. The stage was set for a collision, two people searching for salvation in each other, yet carrying wounds and expectations that would tear them apart. When they finally met in 1952, it felt like fate. But fate, as Hollywood would soon learn, is not always kind. Beginning of love? It was 1952 when Joe DiMaggio first laid eyes on Marilyn Monroe, not in person, but on a movie screen. By then, Joe had retired from professional baseball, his name already enshrined in American history. He was restless, spending time dabbling in business ventures, appearing in the occasional promotional event, but mostly drifting. Fame had made him a legend, but it had also left him deeply lonely. Marilyn, on the other hand, was at the very beginning of her ascent. Small roles had turned into bigger ones, and suddenly she was everywhere, her name whispered in men's clubs, her photographs plastered across glossy magazines, her sensuality making headlines. She wasn't just another starlet. She was Marilyn Monroe, glowing, intoxicating, larger than life. Joe, a man known for his reserved demeanor, surprised everyone when he asked a mutual friend to arrange a dinner with the rising star. Marilyn herself wasn't sure what to expect. She had been warned. He's quiet. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't like publicity. She wondered how a man who shunned the spotlight could possibly fit into her world of flashing cameras and public adoration. But when they finally met, something clicked. Joe's calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos of Hollywood. He wasn't dazzled by her celebrity, and that intrigued Marilyn. At dinner, while most men would have tried to impress her with charm or wit, Joe was content to simply listen. He studied her, quietly, respectfully, like a man who saw through the glittering mask. Marilyn, used to being treated like a commodity, felt a rare sense of safety. Joe seemed to see Norma Jean, not just Marilyn Monroe. For a woman who had spent her life searching for love and stability, that was intoxicating. The courtship of contrasts. Their relationship blossomed quickly, though it was anything but conventional. Joe disliked Hollywood parties, red carpet premieres, and the endless circus of cameras. He preferred quiet nights, dinners at home, and avoiding publicity at all costs. Marilyn, on the other hand, was skyrocketing toward international fame. She was expected at every premiere, every studio party, every glamorous event. Yet somehow, they made it work, at least for a while. Photographers captured images of them holding hands, dining in New York, attending baseball games. The tabloids dubbed them America's couple. To fans, it seemed perfect. The all-American athlete and the all-American beauty queen. Behind the scenes, however, cracks were forming. Joe was fiercely protective, sometimes to the point of jealousy. He disliked the way Marilyn dressed, the way men ogled her in public, the flirtatious nature of her on-screen roles. He wanted her to tone it down, to be his wife, not the world's fantasy. Marilyn, meanwhile, had no intention of abandoning her career. She loved Joe, but she also loved the adoration, the applause, the validation she had never received as a child. Hollywood wasn't just her career, it was her lifeline. Marriage in the spotlight. On the 14th of January 1954, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio were married at San Francisco's City Hall. The crowd outside roared with excitement, fans cheering as the ultimate dream couple stepped into history. Marilyn wore a simple brown suit with a white fur collar, while Joe, ever understated, wore a dark blue suit. Their honeymoon was short-lived, though, as Marilyn immediately left for a USO tour of Korea to entertain American troops. It was there, standing before 100,000 soldiers, her skirt whipping in the cold wind, her laughter echoing through the air, that Marilyn seemed the happiest she had ever been. But Joe was nowhere in sight. He stayed behind, seething quietly, uncomfortable with his wife performing for adoring male fans. That resentment grew. He wanted her home, cooking meals, living the quiet domestic life. She wanted the world. Trouble brews. Still, in the early months, their love was undeniable. Friends recalled moments of tenderness, Joe gently brushing Marilyn's hair, Marilyn calling Joe her rock. But those moments were increasingly overshadowed by tension. Joe couldn't handle Hollywood's obsession with Marilyn's sexuality. The photographs, the late-night shoots, the studio executives who wanted to mold her into the ultimate sex symbol, it all drove him to anger. Marilyn, meanwhile, grew frustrated with Joe's possessiveness. She didn't want to be caged, not after she had fought so hard to escape the cages of her past. And then came the moment that would change everything, the filming of The 7-Year Itch. On a warm September night in 1954, Marilyn stood over a New York subway grate as her white halter dress famously billowed upward. Hundreds of photographers and bystanders screamed with delight as camera flashes immortalized the moment. To the world, it was playful, iconic, unforgettable. To Joe, it was humiliating. That night, their marriage would begin to unravel, setting the stage for scandal, heartbreak, and violence. The marriage of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio began as a fairy tale for the American public. But behind closed doors, the cracks widened quickly, and what once seemed like a storybook, romance began to curdle into something darker, more destructive. The white dress incident. The breaking point came in September 1954, during the filming of The 7-Year Itch. The scene was simple, almost comedic. Marilyn stands over a subway grate, and a gust of air lifts her white halter dress high into the night. To the director Billy Wilder and the crowd of onlookers, it was electric, an instant classic. To the world, it became the image of Marilyn Monroe, cementing her as the ultimate sex symbol of her generation. But to Joe DiMaggio, standing in the shadows, it was unbearable. He watched as hundreds of men ogled his wife, cheering and whistling as the cameras flashed. His blood boiled. Marilyn wasn't just his wife, she was his possession. And now that possession was being ogled by millions. When filming ended that night, Marilyn returned home to find Joe furious. Witnesses claimed the argument escalated into violence. Neighbors reported hearing screams from their apartment. Some accounts suggest Joe hit her, that his rage boiled over into physical abuse. Marilyn, shaken and devastated, later confided in friends that she had never felt so humiliated both by her husband's temper and by his inability to accept who she was. This moment, forever remembered as glamorous in Hollywood history, was in truth the beginning of the end for their marriage. Joe DiMaggio's jealousy wasn't limited to the white dress incident. He despised Marilyn's entire Hollywood image. To him, the sexy dresses, the publicity stunts, and the flirtatious on-screen roles were degrading not only to Marilyn but to him as her husband. Joe wanted a wife who cooked dinner, who stayed at home, who lived in his shadow. But Marilyn was no ordinary woman. She was the face of 20th Century Fox, the obsession of photographers, the dream of millions. She wasn't about to give it all up, not even for Joe. The more her star rose, the more resentful Joe became. His once gentle protectiveness hardened into possessiveness. He would show up unannounced on her film sets, glaring at male co-stars, confronting directors, demanding Marilyn be treated differently. To studio executives, Joe was a nuisance. To Marilyn, he was becoming a prison guard. Marilyn's struggle. For Marilyn, the tension was heartbreaking. She wanted love and stability, but she also needed her career. Acting wasn't just a job, it was her way of proving to the world and to herself that she mattered. But every time she succeeded, every time she stepped further into the spotlight, Joe seemed to pull her back. She began to feel trapped, suffocated by his demands. To cope, she leaned into her Hollywood persona, even more, appearing in glamorous photo shoots, pushing the boundaries of her sex symbol image as if to prove she belonged to herself, not to Joe. Friends noticed the toll it took on her. She was anxious, often tearful, constantly torn between pleasing her husband and pursuing her dream. The little girl who had once been abandoned by everyone she loved was terrified of losing Joe, but terrified too of losing herself. A marriage on fire. The tension exploded again and again. Their fights grew louder, more bitter, more violent. Joe's temper, fueled by his inability to control Marilyn, became a constant shadow over their relationship. One incident, whispered about in Hollywood circles, described Joe lashing out so severely that Marilyn considered leaving him on the spot. She confided in friends, admitting she loved Joe but couldn't live under his control. She told them, "He wants me to be something I'm not, and I can't do it." By October 1954, just 9 months after their wedding, Marilyn filed for divorce. The official reason cited was mental cruelty. To the outside world, it seemed shocking. The perfect couple torn apart in less than a year. But to those close to them, it was inevitable. The public reaction? News of the divorce rocked America. The press, who had painted them as the golden couple, now feasted on the scandal. Headlines screamed of jealousy, control, and betrayal. Fans were divided. Some sympathized with Marilyn. Others criticized her for not settling down. And Joe, ever private, retreated from the spotlight, devastated but unwilling to speak publicly about the split. Marilyn, meanwhile, faced the cameras with her signature smile, though behind the scenes she was in pieces. She had married hoping to find safety, but instead found herself once again abandoned and alone. Their love story, once hailed as a national fairy tale, had devolved into a cautionary tale of passion, control, and the toxic pressures of fame. But this wasn't the end. Their divorce only marked the beginning of a saga that would continue to haunt them both and culminate in one of the most tragic love stories in Hollywood history. By October 1954, only 9 months into their marriage, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio's fairy tale had collapsed. What began as passion had curdled into bitterness, jealousy, and violence. But the final unraveling, the breaking point, was as public as it was devastating. The divorce heard around the world. On the 27th of October 1954, Marilyn appeared in a Los Angeles courtroom to file for divorce from Joe. Wearing a modest black dress, she sat silently as her lawyer announced the grounds. Mental cruelty. The words hung in the air, shocking the public. To most Americans, Joe DiMaggio was a hero, disciplined, stoic, the pride of baseball. The idea that he could be cruel to the radiant Marilyn Monroe seemed impossible. Yet here she was, tears streaming down her face, quietly admitting that her dream marriage had turned into a nightmare. Reporters filled the courtroom, capturing every glance, every tremble of her lips. Outside, crowds gathered, desperate to see the fallen golden couple. Marilyn sobbed openly, collapsing into her lawyer's arms as the proceedings ended. The images were splashed across newspapers the next morning. Marilyn Monroe, the world's sex symbol, broken and weeping. It was the first time the public truly saw the cracks behind her glamorous mask. The final fight. Those closest to Marilyn claimed that the mental cruelty cited in the divorce was only part of the truth. Friends whispered about Joe's violent temper, about physical altercations behind closed doors. The night of the infamous 7-year itch dress scene had been the most explosive, but it wasn't the only time Joe's anger boiled over. Marilyn had confided in actress friend Sheila Stewart that Joe's jealousy was unbearable. "He wants me to stop being Marilyn Monroe," she admitted, "but that's all I know how to be." According to Hollywood lore, their final explosive fight left Marilyn terrified, shaken, and convinced she had to leave. Filing for divorce wasn't just about freedom, it was about survival. The media frenzy. The scandal was irresistible to the press. America's sweetheart had left its baseball hero. The headlines wrote themselves. Blonde bombshell dumps Yankee Clipper. Tabloids speculated endlessly. Was it her career, his temper, or her flirtations with other men? Some journalists painted Marilyn as selfish, a woman who put her career above her marriage. Others demonized Joe as an insecure, controlling husband who couldn't handle a strong woman. Either way, the story was everywhere, cementing their breakup as one of Hollywood's great scandals. Joe's broken silence. For Joe, the divorce was humiliating. A man who had always valued privacy now found himself dissected in the press. He refused to comment publicly, but friends said he was devastated, still deeply in love with Marilyn despite everything. In private, Joe expressed regret. He admitted to friends he had tried to mold her into something she wasn't, and that in doing so, he had lost her. But his pride prevented him from apologizing publicly. Instead, he retreated into himself, a man whose stoicism now seemed less like strength and more like loneliness. Marilyn's lonely triumph. For Marilyn, the divorce was both liberating and heartbreaking. Professionally, she soared. The 7-year itch became a smash hit, and the subway dress scene turned her into an icon forever. Personally, however, she was crumbling. Her dreams of a safe, loving marriage had disintegrated. The little girl inside her, the one who longed for security, was once again abandoned. She threw herself into work, but behind the smile, she was lonelier than ever. Friends noticed her dependence on pills and alcohol increasing. Her laughter, once bubbly and genuine, became forced. In public, she sparkled. In private, she ached. The beginning of a haunting bond. Though their marriage was over, the bond between Marilyn and Joe never fully broke. Joe, despite everything, remained protective of her. He would check in on her, send flowers, and quietly ensure she was safe. Marilyn, in turn, never stopped trusting Joe, even when she trusted no one else. But in 1954, none of that mattered. At that moment, what the world saw was scandal. The glamorous actress leaving the baseball legend, their love story collapsing under the weight of jealousy, fame, and violence. The breaking point had been reached. The fairy tale was over. Yet, as history would prove, this was not the end of Marilyn and Joe's story. Their relationship would continue to evolve in tragic and unexpected ways, long after the divorce papers were signed. Fallout, legal battles, and public backlash. The divorce of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio sent shockwaves through America. What had once been celebrated as a union of two national treasures had now dissolved into scandal, and the public couldn't get enough of it. Public reaction, from fairy tale to tragedy. When the news broke, America split into camps. To many men, Joe was a sympathetic figure, the stoic hero, humiliated by his wife's refusal to settle down. To others, Marilyn was the tragic victim of a controlling, jealous husband. Magazines splashed their faces across covers, often pairing Joe's grim expression with Marilyn's tear-streaked cheeks. Hollywood insiders whispered about the darker truths, the violent fights, Joe's possessiveness, Marilyn's increasing dependence on barbiturates and alcohol. But the studios worked overtime to protect Marilyn's image. She was their golden goose, and scandal could tarnish her marketability. Instead, they leaned into the narrative of Marilyn as the heartbroken but resilient woman who had chosen her career over domesticity. For Joe, who hated publicity, it was agony. Everywhere he went, people stared, whispered, and speculated. He had spent his entire career avoiding the limelight off the field, and now his personal life was the biggest show in town. Legal fallout. Though their divorce was finalized quickly, the legal process laid bare the toxicity of their marriage. The phrase, mental cruelty, stuck like a branding iron, haunting Joe's reputation. Even though he never spoke publicly about what happened, the implication that he had been abusive clung to him. Marilyn, meanwhile, emerged from the legal proceedings both victorious and vulnerable. She had won her freedom, but the price was more exposure than ever before. The world now knew her as not just a star, but a woman whose personal life was as chaotic as her public persona was glamorous. Career explosion for Marilyn. In the months following the divorce, Marilyn's star only grew brighter. The 7-year itch became a global phenomenon, and the image of her white dress billowing over the subway grate became the most famous photograph of the 20th century. But the triumph came at a cost. The scandal with Joe cemented her as the ultimate sex symbol, a title she hated. Marilyn craved respect as an actress, but the studios doubled down on her bombshell image, packaging her for male fantasy rather than artistic credibility. Every time she tried to be taken seriously, the tabloids reminded the world of her failed marriage, her scandalous life, her broken heart. Joe retreats into silence. While Marilyn was everywhere, Joe vanished. He returned to San Francisco, avoiding Hollywood at all costs. Friends said he was devastated, that he loved Marilyn deeply but couldn't reconcile her career with his expectations of a wife. He attempted business ventures, endorsed products, and occasionally appeared at Yankee Stadium, but he never remarried during Marilyn's lifetime. Behind the quiet exterior was a man consumed by regret. Privately, Joe admitted he had tried to control her, and in doing so, he had lost her forever. The backlash against fame. The scandal exposed the brutal double standards of fame. Marilyn was punished for being too sexual, too ambitious, too unwilling to give up her career for a man. Joe, meanwhile, was cast as either the noble hero or the jealous brute, depending on the audience. For Marilyn, the backlash was personal. She was lonely, fragile, increasingly dependent on pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to numb the pain. Her public image was of a woman desired by all, yet she was privately rejected by the one man she had believed would love her unconditionally. Their lingering connection. Despite the divorce, Joe never fully let go. Friends recalled that he would still send Marilyn flowers, still check in on her from a distance. For all his jealousy and anger, his love for her never disappeared. Marilyn, too, clung to Joe in her own way. In moments of despair, she would call him, seeking the stability she could never find elsewhere. Their relationship, though broken, refused to die. By the late 1950 seconds, both had moved on publicly. Marilyn married playwright Arthur Miller, and Joe focused on business. But the shadow of their marriage lingered, a wound neither could heal. The fallout of their scandal had reshaped their lives forever. For Marilyn, it meant a career defined by sex appeal but haunted by loneliness. For Joe, it meant a retreat into silence, his legacy tarnished by whispers of cruelty. And yet, fate had one final twist for them both, a tragic epilogue that would forever link their names long after Marilyn's star had burned out. The love story of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio did not end with their divorce in 1954. In truth, it lingered painful, complicated, and enduring until the very end of Marilyn's life. Marilyn's downward spiral. After their breakup, Marilyn threw herself into a career and later into a marriage with playwright Arthur Miller, but happiness eluded her. The pressures of fame, constant scrutiny, and her own inner demons pulled her into a downward spiral of addiction, insomnia, and fragile mental health. By the early 1960 seconds, Marilyn's life had become tabloid fodder once again. Rumors of affairs with powerful men, including President John F. Kennedy, swirled around her. The woman who once embodied Hollywood's golden dream was now struggling to hold herself together. Through it all, Joe quietly remained in the background. Despite their volatile marriage, he never stopped caring for her. Friends recalled that whenever Marilyn was in crisis, Joe was often the one she called. The final tragedy. On the 5th of August 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Los Angeles home at just 36 years old. The official cause was listed as a probable suicide due to barbiturate overdose, though conspiracy theories still swirl to this day. The news devastated the world. Fans wept openly in the streets. Hollywood lost its brightest star, frozen forever in time as the blonde bombshell who was both adored and broken. Joe DiMaggio was gutted. Despite their divorce, despite everything, Marilyn had remained the love of his life. When he heard of her death, he took charge of her funeral arrangements, determined to protect her in death as he hadn't been able to in life. He banned Hollywood's elite from attending, blaming them for exploiting and destroying her. No studio heads, no celebrities, no Kennedy family members. It was a quiet service, dignified, attended only by close family and a handful of friends. Joe stood solemnly by her grave, his grief etched into his face. Joe's lifelong devotion. For the next 20 years, Joe DiMaggio honored Marilyn in silence. 3 times a week, without fail, he had fresh roses delivered to her crypt at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. He never remarried. He never spoke publicly about their relationship in detail. His devotion was quiet, private, but unwavering. In his final years, Joe reportedly confided to friends, "I finally got it right with her." To him, Marilyn was not just a star, not just an icon. She was Norma Jean, the wounded girl he had loved and lost. Reflection, a love too fragile. The story of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio is one of the great paradoxes of Hollywood. They were America's dream couple, baseball's greatest hero, and Hollywood's brightest star. Yet their love, suffocated by jealousy, fame, and the impossible weight of expectation, could not survive. Their scandal revealed the darker side of celebrity culture, the way the public devours intimacy, the way fame destroys privacy, the way love can't always withstand the spotlight. And yet, for all the heartbreak, their bond never truly died. Joe's lifelong devotion to Marilyn after her death stands as one of Hollywood's most haunting love stories, a reminder that behind the scandal, behind the violence and jealousy, there was also something achingly real. In the end, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio remain frozen in time. 2 legends, 2 icons, forever bound by a love that was as destructive as it was unforgettable.